I want to start by telling you the kind of person I am, because it matters for what I'm about to describe. I'm 31 years old. I work in IT infrastructure, the kind of job where everything has a logical explanation, where you trace a problem back to its source and fix it. I'm not superstitious. I don't watch horror movies. I have never in my adult life been afraid of the dark. I say all of this because if you knew me before October of last year, you would describe me as the last person on earth who would tell a story like this one. I started the overnight security position at Millhaven Road Medical Center because my main contract had dried up and I needed something to cover rent while I looked for the next IT job. The pay was decent, the hours were 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and the work was simple. Walk the building every 2 hours, check that all the exterior doors were secured, log anything unusual in the incident book, and sit at the front desk the rest of the time. The facility was a converted hospital, built in the 1940s, expanded in the 1960s, partially closed and repurposed as a long-term care facility in the late 90s. Most of the original hospital was still intact. Only the east wing was actively in use. The west wing and the third floor of the main building had been decommissioned, locked. My job was specifically to not go up there unless I heard something that required investigation. My supervisor, a compact, efficient woman named Brenda, who had been running night security for the facility for 14 years, walked me through the building on my first night. She was professional and thorough and explained everything clearly. When we reached the door to the third floor stairwell, a heavy fire door with a push bar and a sign that read floor closed, she paused. She said the third floor is off limits. There is no reason for you to go up there. If you hear sounds from up there, log them and call me. Do not investigate alone. I asked what kind of sounds. She looked at me for a moment and then said, footsteps mostly. I thought she was setting up a joke. She wasn't. She handed me her personal cell number written on a card and said that she was serious about calling her. Not the main number, her. She said it in the tone of someone who had learned something the hard way. I filed that away and went back to the front desk. My first 3 nights were completely unremarkable. I did my rounds, logged nothing, sat at the front desk, and worked on a certification course on my laptop between checks. The building was the way old buildings are at night, full of small sounds, pipes and settling, and the distant machinery of climate systems, none of it alarming once you got used to it. I was starting to think the job was going to be straightforward. On the 4th night at approximately 1:15 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the 3rd floor. I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds. These were not ambiguous sounds. They were not pipes expanding or the building settling. They were footsteps, the particular rhythm of a person walking at a normal pace across a hard floor, directly above the section of the 2nd floor where I was standing during my round. They went from east to west across the width of the building, paused, and then went back east. I stood completely still and listened for about 30 seconds. The footsteps stopped. I went back to the front desk and called Brenda. She picked up on the 2nd ring, which told me she'd been awake. It was 1:20 in the morning. She asked where exactly I'd heard them. I described the location, the central section, above the 2nd floor corridor outside the linen storage rooms. She was quiet for a moment. She said, write it in the log, note the time and location, and go back to the desk. She said it had been happening on and off for 2 years. She said the maintenance team had checked the floor multiple times and found nothing. She said the explanation they'd settled on was animals, pigeons getting in through a damaged section of roofing on the north side and walking across the ceiling space. I said they sounded like a person walking. She said a lot of things did. I wrote it in the log and went back to the desk. Over the next week, I heard the footsteps 4 more times. Always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Always in the same general section of the building, the central corridor of the 3rd floor, above the 2nd floor hallway. The pattern was the same each time, walking east to west, a pause, walking west to east. Slow and deliberate. Not frantic, not random. The pace of someone moving through a familiar space. I called Brenda each time. She thanked me for calling, told me to log it, told me it was the animals. On the 8th night of my employment, I pulled out the old incident logs from the cabinet behind the front desk. They went back 4 years, each year in its own binder, written in the handwriting of whoever had been on the desk that particular night. I started with the current year and worked backward. The entries for the footsteps were consistent, same location, same time range, logged by every security officer who had worked the overnight shift in the past 4 years. There were 6 of us in that time from the handwriting. We had all heard the same thing. We had all called Brenda. We had all written it in the log. But in the log from 3 years ago, I found something else. One of the previous officers, a woman named T. Akafer, based on the initial, had written a longer entry than usual. Most of the incident entries were 2 or 3 sentences. This one was almost a full page. I read it carefully. She wrote that on a night in February 3 years earlier, the footsteps had been different. Not the usual east to west pattern. These had stopped directly above the stairwell door on the 2nd floor, the fire door I passed every round. She wrote that they had then slowly begun descending. 1 step at a time. She could track them by the sound, the creak of the upper landing, then the sound of the first flight, then the second landing, then the final flight down to the 2nd floor. She wrote that she had stood at the bottom of the stairwell, listening, as something descended toward the fire door. And then stopped. She wrote that she had stood there for 6 minutes. She knew the exact time because she had looked at her watch when the sounds started and again when they stopped. She had called Brenda. She had written everything in the log in detail, including a note that she did not believe the explanation about animals and that she was formally requesting a proper inspection of the 3rd floor by someone other than the maintenance team. The entry was dated a Thursday. The following Monday, T. Akafer had not filed any further entries. The handwriting in the log changed on that date. A different officer had started the overnight shift. I went through the rest of that year's log carefully. T. Akafer never appeared again. I wrote down her full name as best as I could read it and put it in my pocket. I found her on LinkedIn 3 days later. Temi Akafer, currently working as an administrative coordinator for a property management company in the city. We had one mutual connection, a loose acquaintance from a previous job. I sent her a connection request and a message explaining that I was working her old overnight post and had found her log entry and wanted to ask her about it. She responded in under an hour. Her message was short. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask. She said she'd tell me everything, but that she wanted to do it over the phone, not in writing. We talked the following afternoon. She was composed and direct, the kind of person who has had a long time to process something and has decided the way to handle it is to state the facts clearly. She told me that the night she described in the log was not the worst of it. She told me she had not written down everything. She said that after the footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairwell, she had waited. She had called Brenda, who had told her the same thing she told me. Animals, log it. Go back to the desk. Temi had gone back to the desk. At 3:40 in the morning, she had heard the fire door open. She was at the front desk, which had a direct line of sight down the 2nd floor corridor to the stairwell door. She had watched the door open slowly, fully, as if pushed deliberately by a hand, and remain open. The corridor was empty. She had not moved from the desk for 20 minutes. At some point during those 20 minutes, the door had closed. She told me that what she had not put in the log was what she had seen in the glass panel of the door in the moment before it opened. The stairwell door had a small reinforced glass window, narrow, maybe 5 inches wide, set at approximately eye level. She told me that just before the door swung open, she had seen something on the other side of that glass. She paused before she described it. I could hear her choosing her words. She said it was a face. or the shape of a face. She was specific about the distinction. She said it was positioned at the glass as if someone on the other side was looking through it. She said the features were not distinct. She said it did not look the way a person's face looks when you see them through a small window. I asked her what she meant by that. She said a person's face seen through glass has depth to it. It's set back from the surface. This was flat, like it was pressed against the glass from the other side. She said she had not told Brenda. She said she had given her notice the following morning and worked her last shift that Friday. She asked me if I had gone up to the 3rd floor yet. I said no. She said good. She said that was the right answer. She said stay at the desk, log everything, call Brenda. Then she said something that I've thought about every night since. She said the thing that kept me up afterward wasn't the face. It was the door. Specifically the fact that the door opened all the way and nothing came through it. I kept thinking about why something would open a door and not walk through it. And the only answer I could come up with was that it already knew I was there. That opening the door wasn't about coming out. It was about showing me it could. I want to be honest about something. After talking to Temi, I considered quitting. I thought about it seriously for about 2 days. I ran the numbers on my finances, looked at what I had coming in, considered whether I could afford to walk away from a position that was paying me reasonably well to sit at a desk for 8 hours. I concluded that I couldn't. Not without something lined up. I told myself I would keep looking for IT work and treat this as temporary. I also told myself that Temi had been rattled by something that had a rational explanation and had talked herself into a more frightening version of it over time. Memory is unreliable. The face in the glass had probably been a reflection, her own face, caught in the glass at a strange angle in bad light. The door had probably been moved by a pressure differential, a vent or a draft, or the building's HVAC system creating airflow in the stairwell. I told myself all of this, and I mostly believed it during the day. At night, alone in that building, I believed it less. The footsteps continued. I logged them. I called Brenda. She thanked me and told me it was animals. The pattern never varied. On the 19th night of my employment, a Thursday raining, the kind of sustained fall rain that makes any building sound louder, I was doing my 2 a.m. round when I noticed something. The fire door to the 3rd floor stairwell was open. Not all the way. About 4 inches. The push bar was engaged, holding it in place. I stood in the corridor and looked at it for a long moment. Every time I had passed that door, it had been fully closed and latched. I knew this because I had made a habit, since my conversation with Temi, of pressing my palm flat against it each time I passed to confirm it was secure. I had done this on my 12:30 round 90 minutes earlier. It had been closed. Someone or something had opened it in the past 90 minutes. I took out my phone and called Brenda. She didn't answer. I called twice more. Voicemail both times. I stood in that corridor for probably 2 minutes, phone in hand, staring at the 4-inch gap of darkness in the stairwell door. I could see the bottom of the stairs through it, concrete steps, the edge of the steel railing, the faint ambient light from the stairwell's emergency strip lighting. And from somewhere above, slow and even, the footsteps. I had heard the footsteps dozens of times by then. I knew the sound, but I had never heard them while standing this close to the stairwell door, had never been standing in a position where the sound was coming down clearly, without ceiling or floor between me and the source. Standing in that corridor with the door open 4 inches, I could hear the footsteps clearly. And I could hear something else. Between the footsteps, in the half-second of silence between each one, there was a sound. Low, close, intimate in a way that didn't make sense given where it was coming from. It took me several seconds to identify it. Breathing. Slow and regular. In and out in the gaps between footsteps. The footsteps stopped. The breathing did not. I stepped back from the door. I want to be precise about what happened next because I've replayed it many times. I stepped back, and as I did, the 4-inch gap in the door went dark. Not the ambient dark of the stairwell. Solid dark. Something was blocking the gap from the other side. I turned around and walked to the front desk. I did not run, though I wanted to. I sat down at the desk and I called Brenda again. This time she picked up. Third ring. She sounded awake. Completely awake. Not like someone who had been asleep and missed earlier calls. I told her the door was open and what I had heard and what I had seen. There was a silence that lasted longer than it should have. Then she said, "Is it closed now?" I said I didn't know I was at the desk. She said, "Go check." I said I didn't think I should go check. Another silence. She said, "Marcus, I need you to go check if the door is closed." I said to her very clearly that something had been on the other side of that door in the stairwell, that I had seen it block the gap, and that I was not going to walk down that corridor alone at 2 in the morning. She was quiet for a long time after that. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter. She said, "Stay at the desk. Keep the desk lights on. Don't do your next round." I asked her what was up there. She said she didn't know. I asked her how long it had been there. She said, and this is the part I keep coming back to, she said, "At least as long as I've worked here." That's 14 years. And before that, I don't know. She came in that night. I didn't ask her to, she just arrived at about 3:30, let herself in with her key, and sat down across from me at the front desk. She was in street clothes, no uniform. She had driven in from home in the rain at 3 in the morning, which told me something about how seriously she was taking what I'd described. We sat across from each other, and she told me things she had apparently not told any of the previous overnight staff. She told me that the facility's administration knew about the 3rd floor. Not in the way you'd want them to know about it, not in a "we've investigated, and here's what we found" way. In a "we've decided not to investigate" way. She said that 2 formal requests for a professional paranormal investigation had been filed with the board of directors over the past decade. Both had been declined. She said the reasoning, as it had been explained to her, was liability, that any formal acknowledgement of unusual activity in the facility created legal and reputational exposure that the administration wasn't willing to accept. She told me that the 3rd floor had been closed since 1997. Before that, it had been an active ward, general medical, geriatric care, end of life. She said the closure had been attributed to budget constraints and declining occupancy, which was true as far as it went. She told me that in the year before the closure, 3 patients on the 3rd floor had died under circumstances that were documented as natural, but that the nursing staff at the time had considered unusual. Not unusual in a medical sense. Unusual in that all 3 patients had, in their final days, described the same thing, a figure standing in their room at night. Not a staff member. Not a visitor. A figure that stood in the corner and watched them. All 3 patients had described it identically, tall, still, standing near the window. All 3 had said it spoke to them, though none of them had told the nursing staff what it said. Brenda had found this in the old nursing records from that period, records that were technically archived but had never been digitized and were still in the facility's basement storage. She had read them years earlier, had cross-referenced the room numbers with the current floor plan, and had determined that all 3 patients had been in rooms on the central corridor. The same section of the 3rd floor where the footsteps always came from. I asked her what she thought it was. She said she didn't think in those terms anymore. She said after 14 years she had stopped trying to categorize it and started just trying to manage it. She said it had never come below the 3rd floor, or hadn't, until recently. She said the door incident I'd described was new. I asked her what she meant by "until recently." She looked at the desk between us for a moment. She said that 2 months ago, on a night when she had come in to cover a shift herself, she had found the stairwell door open. She had closed it. She had not told anyone. She said that 1 month ago, doing the same thing, she had heard the footsteps clearly on the stairwell itself, on the steps descending. She had pushed the door closed from the corridor side and held it for 4 minutes. She said the footsteps had stopped halfway down the stairs. She said she didn't know if it had gone back up or if it was still on the stairs, waiting. She had held the door for 4 minutes and then walked away and had not come back to that part of the building for the rest of that shift. She told me all of this in the same even, careful tone she used for everything. She was not frightened exactly. She was the way people are when they've been frightened for so long that the fear has become a kind of furniture. Part of the room. Always there, never not there. I asked her why she hadn't quit. She said she'd thought about it. She said she'd thought about it seriously and had concluded that if she left, whoever came after her would be alone with it, without knowing what they were dealing with. She said she felt responsible for the overnight staff in a way she couldn't just step away from. Then she said, and I need you to know, Marcus, what you did tonight, staying at the desk, not going back to that corridor, was the right thing. Every instinct you had was right. I asked her what would have happened if I'd gone back. She said she didn't know. She said that was the honest answer. She said in 14 years nothing had physically harmed anyone, as far as she knew. I noticed the qualification. I worked the position for another 3 weeks after that night. I needed the money and Brenda had been straight with me, and somehow that made it more bearable, not less. Knowing what I was dealing with was better than the alternative. In those 3 weeks, the door was opened twice more when I passed it on my rounds. Both times I closed it without pausing and went directly to the desk and called Brenda. Both times she answered immediately and told me I'd done the right thing and to stay at the desk. The footsteps continued on schedule. I logged them. I no longer called Brenda for the footsteps, only for the door. We had worked out a system. I want to tell you about the last night because it's the part I find hardest to sit with. It was a Tuesday in November, my last scheduled shift before I moved to a new IT contract that had finally come through. My last night. I had not told the facility I'd given my formal notice, but the transition was being handled slowly and there would be someone covering for me the following week. I had told Brenda, who had been genuinely warm about it, and had said she was glad I was moving on to something better. The shift started normally. Rounds at midnight. Rounds at 2. Quiet building, cold night, the particular stillness that November brings. At 3:15 in the morning, I heard the footsteps. Same location. Same pattern. I logged them. I did not call Brenda. I sat at the desk. At 3:47, I heard something I had not heard before. A knock, single. Deliberate. Coming from the direction of the second floor corridor. From the direction of the stairwell door. I sat completely still. I told myself it was the building. I told myself it was pipes. It came again. One knock. The same careful, deliberate sound. And then after a pause, a third time. I did not move from the desk. The knocking stopped. I sat there until 5 a.m. An hour passed when I would normally do my last round before I walked the corridor. The stairwell door was closed. I pressed my palm against it the way I always did, solid, latched. Cold the way that door was always cold. I stood there with my palm flat on the door for about 10 seconds. And very faintly through the door, through the metal and the fire-rated glass and the concrete of the stairwell beyond it, I felt it. The floor on the other side of the door was vibrating slightly. Rhythmically. Footsteps ascending. I took my hand off the door and walked to the front desk and sat there until 7 o'clock when the morning staff arrived. I handed over the desk, collected my bag, and walked out of Millhaven Road Medical Center for the last time. I have not driven down that street since. I take a different route now. I've thought about what was on the 3rd floor for the better part of a year now. I've thought about the patients who died there in 1996 and the figure they all described standing in the corner. I've thought about Temi Okafor in the face pressed flat against the glass. I've thought about Brenda standing on the other side of a door at midnight, holding it closed with both hands while something waited on the stairs. I've thought about the knock. I've thought about what it means that it knocked. Not that it tried to force the door, not that it rattled the handle, not that it made the incomprehensible sounds of something that doesn't understand what doors are for. It knocked 3 times, the way a person knocks when they want to be let in. I've asked myself what kind of thing knocks, and I keep arriving at the same answer. Something that knows you're on the other side. Something that has learned over a very long time how this works. Something that is still there. Still walking the same corridor. Still waiting for a door to open. I've been trying to write this down for 8 months. Every time I start, I get as far as the 3rd night and stop. Not because I don't remember it, I remember all of it, more clearly than I want to, but because writing it down makes it real in a different way than just carrying it. Once it's written, someone else can read it. Someone else can hold it. And I've spent 8 months trying to convince myself that maybe I misremembered, maybe it wasn't what it seemed, maybe there's an explanation I haven't thought of yet. There isn't. I know that now. So here it is. My name is Joel Marsh. I'm 29 years old. I'm a landscape architect, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life outdoors, reading terrain, understanding how land behaves. I'm comfortable in the wilderness. I grew up camping. My father took me every summer from the time I was 7 until I left for college, every kind of terrain, every kind of weather. I am not a person who gets spooked by forests. I am not a person who hears things in the dark and imagines the worst. I want you to know that going in, because almost everyone I've told this to has started from the assumption that I panicked and misread something ordinary. I didn't panic. What I saw was not ordinary. In June of last year, I drove up to the Harkin Wilderness area in the northern part of the state for a solo trip. 6 days, 5 nights. I'd done the trail once before, 4 years earlier with a group of 3 friends, and I'd wanted to go back alone ever since. There's a section in the middle third of the trail, along the Rennick River, that stays with you. Flat light on moving water, old growth on both banks, the particular silence of a place that hasn't been changed by anything human. I wanted a week of that. I signed the trail register at the trailhead, noted my planned campsites and expected return date, and started in at 8 in the morning on a Monday. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Good weather, good miles, the trail in better shape than I remembered. I camped the first night at Shelter Creek, the second at a flat clearing above the Rennick that I'd used on the previous trip and had been looking forward to returning to. I cooked over a small fire, read until dark, slept well both nights. On the 3rd day I reached the section I'd come for. The Rennick corridor is about 11 miles long. The trail runs along the east bank for most of it, pulling away from the water occasionally where the terrain forces it, but always coming back. The old growth here is primarily Douglas fir and western red cedar. Some of the trees are enormous, 4 and 5 feet across, with canopies so high the light comes down filtered and green the way it does in cathedrals. The undergrowth is dense, but the trail is clear. Walking it is like being inside something. I was planning to camp at the northern end of the corridor, at a site called Rennick Bend, where the river turns west. I'd camped there on the previous trip and remembered it as one of the best sites on the trail, elevated slightly above the river, good wind exposure, a clear view of the water. I got there at about 4 in the afternoon, set up my tent, filtered water from the river, and started on dinner. The evening was very still. The light through the cedars was the color I'd remembered. I sat on a rock above the water and felt the particular peace that only comes after 2 days of moving through a place with no phone signal, no other people, no obligations. At some point during that evening, I think it was around 7, the light still present but beginning to go, I had the feeling of being watched. I want to be precise about this because the feeling matters. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't the specific fear of a threat. It was the sensation that something was paying attention to me, the way you sometimes feel in a crowd when someone is looking at you before you've identified who. A directional awareness without a source. I looked around the campsite. I scanned the tree line on both sides of the river. I saw nothing. Birds were still moving in the canopy. The river was running normally. Nothing in my visual field was wrong. I finished dinner and set up my bear hang and got into the tent at dark. I slept fine. I woke once around 2, heard nothing unusual, went back to sleep. In the morning I packed up and kept moving north. I told myself the feeling from the previous evening had been nothing, the ordinary hyper-awareness of solo camping, the body's threat detection systems running a little hot in the absence of other stimuli. I'd experienced it before. It passes. By midday I was 8 miles past Rennick Bend. The trail had climbed out of the corridor and was running through second-growth timber, less dramatic but easier walking. I stopped for lunch at a creek crossing and checked my map and calculated that I'd reach my planned campsite for the night, a place marked on the map as Spruce Flat, with a few hours of daylight to spare. I reached Spruce Flat at around 3:30. There was already someone there, a camp. Not a person, I didn't see anyone, but a camp, clearly in use. A tent, a small fire pit with ash in it that looked recent, a stuffed sack hanging from a branch on the bare wire. Someone's gear, someone's sight. I stood at the edge of the clearing and waited. Called out hello. No response. I checked my map again. Spruce Flat was large enough for 2 camps. There was another tent pad on the south side of the clearing, marked with a small cairn that I hadn't noticed on the first scan. I set up there 150 feet from the other tent and waited to see who would come back. No one came back. By 5 o'clock, I'd been at the site for an hour and a half and no one had appeared. I walked over to the other camp, not touching anything, just looking. The tent was a 2-person dome, older, a brand I didn't recognize. The fire pit ash was cold but not weathered. It had been used within the last day or 2. A single boot was sitting outside the tent vestibule, just one. I want to pause on that detail because it's the kind of thing that your brain registers as wrong before it can articulate why. One boot. Outside the tent. The other boot presumably inside or somewhere I couldn't see. But one boot outside sitting upright, like someone had taken it off and set it down and then, what? Gone into the tent with one boot on. Left the site with one boot. I looked at the trail leading away from the clearing in both directions. No one coming. I went back to my own camp and made dinner and kept watching the other tent. No one came back that night. At some point after dark, I had been reading by headlamp. It was maybe 9 o'clock. I heard something move in the trees beyond the other camp. Not close. 40, 50 feet into the tree line on the far side of the clearing. Movement in the undergrowth, the particular sound of something large displacing vegetation as it moved. It lasted for maybe 20 seconds and then stopped. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Nothing. Then the river, the wind in the canopy, the small sounds of a forest at night. I turned the headlamp back on. Bear, I thought. Almost certainly bear. The other camp had food hung, but the fire had been cold for 2 days. The smell would have dissipated, attracted attention. A bear investigating an abandoned camp was not alarming. Bears investigate things. It was probably gone. I stayed in the tent until morning. The other tent was still there when I woke up. Still no one. I looked at it for a while over my camp stove, drinking coffee, trying to decide what to do. The person who owned that camp had been gone for at least 1 full night. The possibilities ranged from went for a day hike and got back late, left before I woke up, to things I didn't want to think about. I noted the tent brand and color in my journal. I decided if I saw a ranger station or another hiker, I'd mention it. I packed up and moved on. The feeling of being watched came back that afternoon. Stronger than before. strong enough that I stopped twice on the trail and turned around and stood still and scanned the trail behind me for a full minute each time. The trail was empty. The trees on both sides were undisturbed. I could see 100 feet back both times, and there was nothing there. I kept moving. I camped that night at a site called Three Forks, where two small creeks joined the main trail. I was tired in the particular way you get tired on the third or fourth day of a trip, deeply physical, the kind of tiredness that makes everything quieter and slower. I ate quickly, got the bear hang up, and was in the tent before 8. I woke at some point in the night, I don't know what time, I hadn't looked at my watch, to a sound. It was close, within the campsite. Footsteps, slow and deliberate on the ground outside the tent. The specific sound of weight on dry leaves and soil, moving around the perimeter of the tent. I lay completely still. My hand found my headlamp in the dark. The footsteps continued around the tent. Unhurried, methodical, not the random movement of an animal investigating, too regular, too slow, too deliberate. One step a pause, another step. Moving around the tent the way you'd move around something you were studying. They stopped, I waited. 10 seconds, 20, a minute. I turned on the headlamp and unzipped the tent door. Nothing. Empty campsite. Trees at the edge. The creeks running in the dark beyond. My bear hang moving slightly in the breeze. No footprints visible in the headlamp beam on the dry ground. I sat in the tent door for a long time and looked at the darkness between the trees. Then I closed the tent and turned off the headlamp and lay with my eyes open until it was light enough to pack. I started moving at first light. I want to tell you that I was calm and methodical about this. I was not. I was afraid in the specific way that you are afraid when you don't know what you're afraid of, when the thing you're responding to has no shape, no category, no rational explanation. I packed my camp in 12 minutes, which is about half the time it normally takes, and I was on the trail before the sun was fully up. I had 1.5 days left on the trail. The fastest exit was forward, not back. I pushed hard all morning. 12 miles by noon, which was more than I normally covered in a full day. I stopped at a creek crossing to filter water and eat something and rest my feet, and it was while I was sitting there, eating crackers and peanut butter, that I noticed the mark on the tree. It was on a cedar about 10 feet off the trail on the uphill side. A mark in the bark, not carved, not cut, but scraped or worn, roughly at eye level. A vertical line about 18 inches long with two shorter horizontal lines crossing it at uneven intervals. Not a blaze, trail blazes in this system were painted rectangles, not cut into the bark. Not an old cut from logging, the wrong pattern and too recent. Something had made this mark deliberately and recently. I took a photo of it and kept moving. I found the second mark an hour later. Same pattern, same height, on a fir tree 15 feet off the trail on the downhill side. The third was another 2 miles on. By the time I found the fourth mark, I had stopped rationalizing. 4 marks, same pattern, same height, spaced roughly 2 miles apart along the trail. Someone had made these. Someone had moved through this section of trail and marked trees at regular intervals. Marking a route. I thought about the camp at Spruce Flat. The cold ash. The single boot. I thought about the footsteps around my tent. I moved faster. In the late afternoon, with the trailhead perhaps 4 miles out, I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped. There was a man standing on the trail, 40 feet ahead of me. Standing completely still, facing away from me, looking at something in the trees on the left side of the trail. I stopped moving. I don't know why. Instinct, the same instinct that made me freeze when I heard the footsteps, some part of my brain that was processing threat faster than conscious thought. I stood still and looked at him. He was tall, dark jacket, dark pants, no pack. He was just standing there completely still, staring into the trees. I stood there for probably 30 seconds. He didn't move. I said hello. He turned. I want to describe his face carefully because I've thought about it many times since. He was older, I'd say late 50s, maybe 60, pale. His eyes were wide in a way that didn't read as normal, the whites visible all the way around the iris, the look of someone in a state of sustained alertness or sustained fear. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're not entirely sure they're real. I asked if he was all right. He said, "Don't stop moving. Keep walking. Don't look into the trees." His voice was flat and quiet and completely certain. I asked him what was out there. He shook his head. He said, "Just keep moving. Stay on the trail. Don't stop until you're at the parking lot." I asked him again what was out there. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "It's been following you since the Rennick. I've been watching it follow you. Don't give it a reason to stop following and start doing something else." I stood on that trail and I felt the ground under my feet and the weight of my pack, and I thought about everything I'd experienced over the past 3 days with the absolute clarity that comes with genuine fear. I asked him, "What is it?" He said he didn't know what it was. He said he'd been in these woods for 11 years as a seasonal ranger, and he'd seen it 3 times before, and each time it had followed someone, and each time he'd watched and not intervened, and the people had gotten out and been fine. He said the only time it went wrong was when someone stopped. When someone tried to find it instead of walking away from it. I asked what happened then. He didn't answer that. He said 4 miles to the parking lot. Don't stop. Don't look into the trees. Don't respond to any sounds that seem to be coming from off the trail. I asked him if he was coming with me. He said he wasn't. He said he was going to stay where he was for a while. I looked at him for a moment, this man standing alone on a trail in the late afternoon light, no pack, no gear, just standing there with those wide, pale eyes watching the trees, and I made a decision. I walked. I did not look into the trees. I did not stop. I heard things in the forest on both sides of the trail, sounds I told myself were birds, were wind, were water, and I did not stop. I reached the trailhead parking lot at dusk. My truck was the only vehicle there. I got in and drove. I called the ranger station from the road and reported the abandoned camp at Spruce Flat. I described the tent, the single boot, the cold ash. The ranger who answered took the information without apparent alarm and said they'd send someone to check. I didn't mention the man on the trail. I don't know why. I think I was afraid that if I described him, I would have to describe everything else, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. When I got home, I uploaded the photographs from the trip. The trail, the river, the old growth, the campsites. Normal photographs from a hiking trip. I found one I didn't remember taking. It was in the sequence from the second day, somewhere in the Rennick corridor. A shot of the trail ahead. I took photos like that sometimes while walking, a habit I had, pointing the camera forward to capture the light or the terrain without stopping. I didn't always look at what I was shooting. This one showed the trail running straight for about 60 feet before it bent left and disappeared. At the bend, just at the point where the trail curved out of view, there was a figure. Standing at the edge of the frame, still. Facing back down the trail. Facing the camera. Facing me. I've looked at that photograph many times. The figure is at sufficient distance that I cannot make out features. I cannot tell you what it is or what it looks like up close. I can tell you that it is standing upright, that it is the approximate height and shape of a person, and that it is facing directly toward me. I don't know how long it had been behind me at that point. I don't know if it's the same thing that walked around my tent at Three Forks. I don't know what the marks on the trees meant, or who made them, or whether they were meant for me, or for something else. I don't know what happened to the person who left their camp at Spruce Flat. I called the ranger station once more, 2 weeks after the trip, to follow up on the abandoned camp. The ranger I spoke to checked the records and told me they'd sent someone to Spruce Flat and found no tent, no gear, nothing. The site was empty. I asked if they'd found any sign of who had camped there. She said no. I asked if anyone had been reported missing in the Harkin area. A pause. Then she said that was not information she could share. I thanked her and hung up. I haven't been back to Harkin. I don't know if I will go back. I think about the corridor along the Rennick, the light through the old-growth cedars, the flat water and the silence, and I feel the pull of it the same way I felt it before. It was the place I wanted. It was everything I hoped it would be. But I also think about the feeling on the third evening, the directional awareness without a source, the sense of something paying attention. And I think about what the man on the trail said. It had been following me since the Rennick. Which means it was there on the second evening when I sat on the rock above the water and watched the light change and felt, for a moment, completely at peace. It was standing somewhere in those trees watching me feel at peace. And I didn't know. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the fear, not the footsteps, not even the photograph. Just the fact that it was already there, already watching, before I had any idea. That the peaceful evening I remember so clearly, the best evening of the trip, was not what I thought it was. I was never alone in those woods. Not for a single moment of that trip. And I had no idea. I don't know exactly when I started noticing her. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the moment she appeared. I don't have a clean moment like that. No single night where I looked up and saw something that shouldn't have been there. It was gradual. The way you don't notice a crack in a wall until it's already run from the baseboard to the ceiling. By the time I understood what was happening, it had been happening for a long time. My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm 34 years old. I'm a freelance copy editor, which means I work from home, which means I spend a significant amount of time alone in a house that I know very well. I mention this because it's relevant. I am someone who notices things. I notice inconsistencies in manuscripts, misplaced commas, continuity errors, sentences that don't track. I notice when the light in a room changes, when a piece of furniture has been shifted 2 inches, when a sound is coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. My attention to detail is my professional asset. I want you to understand that before I tell you what I noticed in the house on Carver Street. I moved there in March of the year I turned 32. The house was a 1920s colonial, 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors throughout. The previous owner had lived there for 40 years, a widower named Mr. Phelps, who had moved to assisted living and whose children had sold the house as part of settling his affairs. I knew this because my realtor told me, and because the house still had small markers of long occupancy, picture hooks on the walls with no pictures, a cabinet in the kitchen that had been painted over so many times it no longer closed flush, a smell of old paper in the second-floor landing that no amount of cleaning seemed to reach. I loved it. I want to be clear about that. I loved that house from the first showing. There is a particular quality that old houses have, a settled weight, a sense of accumulated time, that I find deeply comforting. I moved in with 3 carloads of boxes and a cat named Elliot and felt, by the first night, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first thing I noticed was the basement door. The house had a door off the kitchen that led to the basement stairs. It was a solid core door with a conventional knob latch, no deadbolt. On the 3rd or 4th morning after I moved in, I came downstairs to make coffee and found the door standing open about 6 inches. I closed it and thought nothing of it. Old houses, uneven floors, latches that don't catch cleanly, this was not alarming. It was open again the following morning. Same 6 inches. Same angle. I closed it and tested the latch. It caught securely. I pushed on the door from both sides. It held. I couldn't reproduce the gap without deliberately opening the door. I closed it and went upstairs and didn't think about it again for 3 days. On the 7th morning I came downstairs and it was open again. Still 6 inches. Still the same angle. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a moment. Elliot was sitting on the kitchen counter the way he wasn't supposed to be, watching the basement door the way cats watch things that are not there. I walked over and closed it and checked the latch and went to make my coffee. That evening I got a door wedge from the hardware store and wedged it shut from the kitchen side before bed. In the morning, the wedge was on the floor. The door was open. 6 inches. I told my friend Dana about it over the phone that week. Dana is a sensible person. She is an ER nurse. She is not easily rattled. She deals in concrete realities. She suggested the possibility of air pressure from the basement, a difference in temperature creating a draft strong enough to dislodge the wedge. She suggested I get the latch hardware replaced. I got the latch hardware replaced. The door still opened. After 6 weeks, I stopped trying to keep it closed. The basement was just a basement, concrete floor, storage boxes, the furnace, nothing unusual. Whatever was causing the door to open was a mechanical issue I hadn't solved yet. I filed it under old house problems and moved on. I want to tell you about the photographs now because they come next in the sequence and I think the sequence matters. I had printed a set of photographs from a road trip I'd taken the previous summer, 12 photos, landscapes mostly, a few of friends, and I had them pinned in a rough grid on the corkboard above my desk in the upstairs office. I'd had them there since my first week in the house. I knew exactly what they looked like and exactly where each one was pinned. In October, 8 months after I moved in, I was sitting at my desk working when I noticed one of the photographs was different. Not a different photo. The same photo. But something in it was different. It was a landscape shot, a field at dusk, a tree line in the background taken from the window of a moving car. I had taken it on a highway in Vermont. I remembered taking it. I had looked at this photo dozens of times since printing it. In the background, at the edge of the tree line, there was a figure. I took the photo down and held it under the desk lamp. The figure was small, barely visible, at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by the tree line. The image quality at that distance was grainy and indistinct. It could have been a person. It could have been a shadow. It could have been a deer. I told myself it was a deer. I pinned the photo back up and went back to work. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about the figure at the tree line and trying to remember if it had been there the last time I looked at the photo and the time before that, and whether I would have noticed it if it had been. I was nearly certain I would have. I was nearly certain it was new. I also thought about the fact that I had taken that photo from a moving car. The shutter speed would have been fast. Whatever was at the tree line had been there, standing still in that exact position at that exact moment. I told myself it was a deer and went to sleep. The second photograph was a month later. This one was a shot of a rest stop parking lot taken as a joke because I'd thought the light was interesting, gray and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look like a film still. Taken through the windshield of my car. I could see the dashboard reflected faintly in the glass. There was a figure standing 2 rows of cars away, facing my car. Facing the camera. Facing me. I hadn't noticed it before. I was certain I hadn't noticed it before. The figure was standing completely still between 2 parked cars, and it was facing directly toward me, and its face was a pale oval at that distance, featureless in the flat gray light. I took the photo down and put it face down in a drawer. I went through the other 10 photographs carefully. I didn't find anything else. I told myself I'd missed the figures both times because the photos were small and I hadn't been looking closely enough. I told myself there was no pattern. I kept the photo in the drawer. I want to be honest about something. I know, reading this back, that I sound like someone who was rationalizing. I was. I was doing it deliberately, and I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway because the alternative, accepting that something was wrong, something I didn't understand, felt much worse than continuing to find explanations. This is what I tell people when they ask me why I didn't do something sooner. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding reasons not to be afraid. In January, 10 months after I moved in, I started seeing her. I used seeing loosely at first because the early sightings were not clear. The first time was peripheral. I was walking from the kitchen to the living room late at night, and I caught, at the very edge of my vision, the impression of someone standing in the hallway. Not a full figure. Not a clear image. The suggestion of a person, gone as soon as I turned to look. I turned on every light in the hallway and found nothing. The second time I was sitting at my desk in the upstairs office, and I looked up from my work and saw, in the reflection in the dark window, a shape standing in the doorway behind me. I spun around. The doorway was empty. The third time I was lying in bed at 2 in the morning, not yet asleep, and I saw a figure standing at the foot of the bed. I want to tell you that I screamed or turned on the light or called for help. I didn't. I lay completely still and looked at the figure, and it looked at me, and after a period of time that I cannot accurately estimate, it was gone. Not gone as in it moved or walked away. Gone as in one moment it was there, and the next moment it was not. I lay still for a long time after that. She was a woman. I understood that from the first full sighting. Small and slight, wearing what looked like a dark dress, the kind of long dress that had not been fashionable in a very long time. Her hair was pale. Her face, in the moments when I could see it, had the quality of a face seen through frosted glass. The features were there but indistinct, slightly out of resolution. She was always still. That was the thing I came to notice most. She never moved while I was watching her. She stood and she watched, and then she was gone. Elliot saw her too. I know how that sounds, but I want to include it because it matters to me as corroboration of my own perception. Cats are not reliable witnesses in the way humans are, but they respond to stimuli. On 4 separate occasions over the following weeks, I observed Elliot staring at a fixed point in a room, the doorway, the foot of the stairs, the corner near the window in the office, with the particular rigid attention that cats give to things that are genuinely there. On 2 of those occasions, I looked at the point he was staring at and saw nothing. On the other 2, I saw her. I called Dana. Dana drove up on a Saturday. She spent the afternoon in the house. She walked every room. She opened the basement door and went down the stairs and came back up. She sat at my desk and looked at the corkboard and looked at the photographs. She looked at the Vermont photograph for a long time. She said, "Claire, that's a person." I said I thought it might be a deer. She said, "That's not a deer." We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything, the basement door, the photographs, the sightings. All of it. Dana is not a person who dismisses things she doesn't understand. She listened without interrupting, and when I was finished, she was quiet for a while. She asked me if I felt unsafe. I thought about that carefully. The honest answer was that I didn't. The woman in the house had never moved toward me, had never made a sound, had never done anything except stand and watch. The absence of threat was itself unsettling. It implied a patience, a settled presence, a sense that she was not trying to frighten me but simply existed in the space I was occupying. I told Dana I didn't feel unsafe. I told her I felt watched. Dana stayed the night. She slept in the spare room. In the morning over coffee, she told me that at approximately 3 a.m. she had woken to find a figure standing in the doorway of the spare room. She described her exactly. That week I contacted the family of Mr. Phelps, the previous owner. His daughter, a woman named Kathleen who lived 3 states away, was willing to talk on the phone. I explained that I'd found some things in the house I was curious about, old documents, photographs, and asked if she could tell me anything about the history of the property. Kathleen was quiet for a moment when I asked. Then she said, "Was it the woman in the dress?" I sat down. Kathleen told me that her father had lived in that house for 40 years, and for most of those 40 years he had coexisted with what he called the resident. He had never been frightened of her. He had, over decades, come to think of her as a kind of permanent fixture, like the cabinet that wouldn't close or the draft from the basement. Something old and settled that had simply decided to stay. Kathleen told me that her father had believed the woman predated the house itself. He had done some informal research into the history of the property, the land it was built on, the previous structures. He had found records of a family who had farmed that land in the late 1800s. He had found a death record, a woman in her 30s, cause of death listed as fever, buried on the property in 1887. He had never found a name. I asked Kathleen why she hadn't told me before I bought the house. She said, "I thought about it. I genuinely thought about telling you. But my father lived there 40 years and she never hurt him. She just watched. He thought she was lonely, honestly. He thought she just didn't want to be alone." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I looked at the basement door, which was open its usual 6 inches. I thought about a woman buried in the ground beneath a house that had been built over her grave more than 100 years ago. I thought about what it means to be in a place so long that you become part of it. I thought about Mr. Phelps living here for 40 years and coming to think of her as a fixture, something old and settled. I thought about the photographs, about a figure at the edge of a tree line in Vermont, standing still, watching a car pass. About a figure in a parking lot facing the camera in flat gray light. She had been following me. Not haunting the house. Following me. I don't know what to do with that. I have been living with that knowledge for 2 years now. She still appears less frequently than before, but she appears. Always still, always watching, always gone before I can look directly at her for long. Elliot has stopped reacting to her. I think he's gotten used to her the way you get used to anything that persists long enough. I have not gotten used to her. I don't think I will. But I have arrived at something that is not quite peace and not quite acceptance, a kind of coexistence, the same thing Mr. Phelps must have arrived at over his 40 years. There's a question I come back to when I can't sleep, lying in the dark, aware of the possibility that there is a figure standing somewhere in the room that I can't see. The photographs were taken before I moved into that house. The Vermont photo, the parking lot photo, both from the summer before. She was there. She was watching. She was in places I had been, in images I had taken, before I ever set foot on Carver Street. Which means she wasn't haunting the house. She found me somewhere else. And she followed me home. I don't know what I did to deserve that kind of attention. I don't know where she came from or what she wants or why she watches the way she does, patient, steady, present in the periphery of my life in a way I cannot explain or undo. I only know that she is still here, and that she was here before I was, and that whatever she is waiting for, she has been waiting for it for a very long time. She can wait longer than I can. I understand that now. That's the part that stays with me. Not the figure at the foot of the bed. Not the face pressed close to the dark. Not even the photographs, which I have not looked at again, and which are still in a drawer in the upstairs office. Just that. She has been waiting longer than I have been alive. And she will still be waiting long after I am gone.